Gurve Gaur Chanjaya Radhikaya Tadali Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tad Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Vanchakalpaturubhyascha Kripa Sindhuvevaja Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Garadhara Shivasari Gaur Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Dandavat Pranam devotees. So, this is really not meant to be a video. You know, this is not normally my time for videos. In fact, I've got about 20 minutes before I need to be on my evening phone conference class. So, I'm just responding to someone who had questions on the video recently done on the dismantling of atheism. And I'm just going to read directly the questions and give responses to them. Some places I've noted down the resources they've asked for. So let me get right to it. Devotees asking that at minute 10:40, you say there was a group of scientists who said that if you want to do science with us, you have to reject the church and God. So that's a misquote, actually. So I did go back and look at it. And actually, for context, it should start at minute 9:37. And the actual statement that was there was, let me see, they made the standard, you have to leave God back at the church. So there was never a statement that you have to reject God. It was that you have to leave God back at the church. So where that statement came from was in an article on the history of, I think his name is Georges Lemaitres, and he was a Catholic. I may be pronouncing it wrong. He was a French Catholic priest, actually, who was the one who postulated the Big Bang Theory. So he postulated the Big Bang Theory, and he, in the article, it mentions that there was a statement that he made. Let me get to the statement. Oh, here it is. Let me get to that statement if I can find it. Oh, here it is. It is tempting to think that Lemaitres' deeply held religious beliefs might have led him the notion of might have led to the notion of a beginning of time. Well, first of all, they're talking about kind of what was the setup for him discovering the Big Bang Theory and all. Let me get to the point here. Yet, Lemaitre, if that's the proper pronunciation, clearly insisted that there was neither a connection nor a conflict between his religion and his science. Rather, he kept them entirely separate, leaving God at the church. So, that's from an article. Well, let me get the article here. Oh, George Lemaitre, father of the Big Bang. So that was an article that I looked up when I was just looking at stuff. So that's one point. So there was never a question that the statement was that one should reject the church and reject God. Okay, next thing was, let me move right along here. Then he gives a series of, it's mostly paraphrasing here because obviously they're not exact, but I won't hold anybody to having to try to listen and note down every single word you're going to write. This is why I do these things in videos, because actually the screen time, staring at a screen and typing, it's not, I don't think it's healthy for one. I think also it's just tedious. So the next actual question that he has, let me look at it. You say that scientists claim that anything they don't say can't be considered science. In other words, you say that scientists say only they can determine what is science. So this was actually in large part taken from statements that he himself has made. There are some statements I have in the research that I was doing, but a great part of it, if you go back and look in any of the threads on this conversation, were actually statements that he himself made about science being determined by, sort of the overwhelming body of scientists, right? This is the general definition that they give, etc., etc. So a part of it was a response to that. Also, Let me go ahead and look in here. Oh, by the way, the other thing about the keeping the religion and science separate, that also came from an article I read on Francis Bacon, in which he declares the same thing. So let me move on from that. But in terms of who defines science and so forth, there was an article was written, there's a wiki article, and it says that one of the complaints that many, even scientists had, was that, I'll quote it here, quote, many scientists also complain that the requirement for increased funding makes a large part of the scientific activity, like filling out grants, requests, and so forth, and other budgetary things, bureaucratic activity. Because when you want to fill out a grant and so forth, now obviously they're not talking about just the scientific administration or scientific establishment, but they're talking about having to validate themselves in their fields, and that's based on a whole thing. I don't want to get into it here, it's going to complicate it, and it's going to extend everything, but there's an H score. An H score is how many times you've been published, peer-reviewed, all these things. Now obviously there's an establishment that controls that. So another instance that is probably really prominent was the court cases that came up. I think one came up in 2005, right? I think it was Klitzmiller versus Dover in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And this was about the introduction of ideas about changing the current Darwinist evolutionary theory in schools. Because obviously, all of us who are a little bit old know that when you went to school, that was what was taught. Whether you paid attention to it or not is another thing, but that's what was taught. So there was a push that, perhaps because there have been some faults found in the theory overall, and they're increasing, plus there are other alternative possibilities, perhaps the students should be encouraged to look at Darwin, look at other things, and be more critical thinkers when it came to such an issue as the origin of life, evolution, etc., etc. Because even though sometimes they try to make it that it's not connected, there is certainly a link between the entire system of theories: Big Bang, origin of life, evolution. There are connections, whether they're admitted to or not. So in part, what happens when you start trying to change the curriculum, which is foundational, because this is what children learn. Children are going to learn what they get in school, and that becomes their particular perspective on that issue. So certainly this was a case where the scientific establishment overwhelmingly protested against that idea of introducing, either admitting that there are some problems with Darwin's theory of evolution, and alternatively, it wasn't all one thing, but alternatively there was ideas to introduce the idea of intelligent design, which is really a thrust right now in the scientific community, obviously. And what is intelligent design? It means simply considering that at the end of the day, when all science has been considered, there are some variables that just are not accounted for. So the idea that perhaps there is, looking at the complexity of everything in science, the need to admit that there is some intelligent design which is at play, which is beyond the purview of simple natural phenomenon, right? So they wanted to have that introduced, and they pushed back on it, declaring that it was religious and so forth, so on. So that was also, I quoted, I think, from where that was from the court case, and I think Prabhu, who I'm sending this to, actually you're familiar with it, okay? Let me move on here, because he was asking what's the support for this. Then I'm just going to read the highlighted things, because I think that's his actual question. You say the position of modern science is atheistic, and that they know God does not exist. No, that's not quite what was said. This is at 1341 in the video. So if you go to 1341, and I always say go a little bit prior, because then you get a context and you get an actual statement. That's the position of the modern scientific establishment, that they know there is no God. So I think you should go and hear the actual statements, because I don't believe that's it. What I have said is that in the absence of God in science, science becomes essentially atheistic, right? So you can nuance that in many ways, that, well, no, it doesn't necessarily mean that. It's just may be a neutral indifference to whether there is or isn't. So of course the whole premise of what I'm arguing is that God or not God is a serious variable to be considered in the total calculus of what you're coming to as conclusions. In origin of life, in the nature of the existence of human beings, everything is pretty much contingent on whether you either remove that variable, concluding, no, definitely there's no God situation, so we've accommodated clearly that that's not the case, there is no God, so we can safely move forward with our scientific method and make our conclusions based on that. But my premise is that if you start a calculation, or if you tell somebody to look at a particular mathematical equation, you take a piece of paper and you hold it over the first part of the equation, and then you tell them to read from here. And then they read, 3 plus 1 is 4, plus 1 is 5. Well, certainly everything they've seen from what you left uncovered certainly could be true. But if you want to definitely know that the conclusive answer here is going to be 5, you definitely need to uncover that first variable, because it will make a big difference in whether the answer, when you look at the overall problem, is 5 or whether it's something else. So science, in the absence of looking at that variable and establishing its existence or non-existence, is crucial to the truth of science. The intellectual exercise of science is one thing. The conjecture of science is one thing. But establishing truth and science being used as a means to determine many factors about our life, right? It's actually purporting, though it may not admit it, to establishing truths that we need to live by. You understand? In that case, you do need to accommodate all variables, right? And if God is a variable, I'm not speaking in a religious context here, a theological context, just the actual scientific, because science is based on a method, right? Like hypothesis, observations, predictions, all these different things. So you would say, that you are going to do an observation. Well, how can you begin the observation and the experimentation and you haven't accounted for maybe a huge variable? So part of the problem here, and I don't want to get so off track that it, because this is, meant for this devotee to hear, and I'm sure he just wants to get his questions answered. But if you don't account for that variable, then we don't know for sure how to conclude whatever's coming out in this experimentation, observation, and the rest of the scientific method. We can't conclude. Because if there is God, and that's a part of this situation, that's a big difference. Because then now you're not talking about necessarily what we have understood in full about everything, but we'd have to then make some reference to, well, what is said by God. You understand? So that, in other words, you have to rule in or out that variable. That's the point. Now, it's not an easy thing to do. Therefore, the comfort zone now is we'll make a neutral separation. We'll just deal with the science part, and we won't really admit to a God or not God, right? But then, in so many cases, when there is science that you're saying you're not adverse to admitting God, when science is introduced that adds that variable, there's vehement pushback on it. So if you just look into contemporary science, there's a huge sort of, I don't call it a war, but whatever you want to call it, a conflict between the continuum of origin of life explanations and introduction of intelligent design. What simply is saying at this point, though certainly most of the people pushing it have religious background, they're simply saying we need to look at this as a variable in our scientific approach, right? And they're willing to put it to the same scientific methodology that they use for everything else. Let's test it, let's observe it, the whole 9 yards. So that pushback is indicative of what he was asking here about. Let me go back. Oh, the pushback that they're doing is evidence of the fact that they want to, overtly or covertly define what is going to be called science. In fact, many people in the intelligent design community have brought up the fact that when any debate comes up or anything else, they kind of indicate that it's at best a pseudoscience. So they don't give the same credibility of science to it. So they're setting the parameters of what's going to be science, and they're ruling out anything that doesn't fit in those parameters. All right, let's move on here. Then he's asking, what was my support for this? I just gave that. I gave the court case, and I gave other things. These are things that I looked at before I spoke on it. All right. Then he says, oh, okay, let's go back here. I might have gotten a little things confused here. You say the position of modern scientists is, I'm going to just read this part. That is the position of the modern scientific establishment. They know there is no God. So that was what we were talking about. So, for the most part, I didn't say that. That's one thing. So we go back and look at the tape. Now, this could be paraphrasing. Again, I'm not holding a person because they're not getting every single word exact, but we need to have some context. I'm saying that you'll have people. Richard Dawkins is an example. He's not the entire body of scientific establishment, but he obviously says very clearly he doesn't believe there is a God. Right? And there are many, many people in the scientific establishment who have the same feeling, that there actually is no God. Right? Of course, there's people in the scientific community who say there is. But here's another situation. You can fully be invested in a Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever you might be, but you have to leave that at your place of worship. It's not necessarily allowed to be brought in as a variable in the scientific community you may be operating in. All right. Let me see. What is the support for the statements? I just gave that, right? That, you have people who actually say there's no God, but I did not say that that was a unanimous situation. Anyway, so now these guys, he's saying something else I'm saying. I'll just read his things, actually. I'll skip that. What they do is come up with principles that define, I never used epistemology, I don't think I said that. And using those, I said parameters probably, they define parameters, and using those as guidelines, they allow or disallow things to be labeled as actually science. So we just went over that. I'm not going to reiterate it. I think that will just elongate the tape. I made the point already that the scientific establishment, certainly as evidenced by the court cases in the schools I mentioned, by the huge pushback they're giving India for removing Darwinism from their textbooks, right? So there is a lobby, there is a establishment, and that establishment definitely attempts to define the parameters of what is science and what's either pseudoscience or not science at all. And that has a huge implication and impact on how things move forward. For instance, if somebody's doing great research into the effects of consciousness in relation to biology and chemistry and so forth, right now, that's not going to be something that necessarily will be able to enter the mainstream of discussion in science. You understand? There's certainly peripheral studies going on with it, and people are obviously getting grants and so forth and so on. But in the mainstream of science, you can't find that there's a mainstream study on consciousness, right? In fact, in even soft sciences, they're not clear, meaning psychology, etc. But also, even in other scientific fields, so far it's been described as the hard problem, right? There isn't really, well, let's go after it. Let's solve the hard problem. Some people may on the periphery, like I said, be trying, but it's not already included in the calculations of, well, does it exist or not? And again, consciousness will have a huge implication in all kinds of considerations about everything in science, right? All right. So then he's answering his own question, I guess. Okay. Let me go on, let me move on. People often get hung up on some idea that science can only deal with things that can be directly observed. So then he's saying, on my part, that's simply a poor understanding. But if you listen to any number of debates, any number of presentations by the, modern scientific community, because modern scientific community is AKA for scientific community that doesn't necessarily synthesize a consideration of God. What to speak of actually synthesizing a God understanding, but they don't synthesize a investigation even of it per se. So they will directly tell you that really science is based on what we can empirically observe. There's no doubt how many times it's been said, even by the person who's asking me the questions, that that's the basis of what they consider science. So I guess he's now, I'm not sure, because it's kind of confusing format here. All right, let me move on. So at minute 21, we talked about the burden of proof. Normally, the atheist put the burden of proof on the theist. I certainly said that. The atheist walks in, if there is a God, show me. Certainly I said that. And that's normally what I've seen, encountered, and experienced. So that's what's going on today. So, yeah, that may be a direct statement. So his point is just a rewriting of a narrative. So let me read it. It's more like there is a conversation going on, and the theist says, such and such was done by God. At that point, the other person can ask, what is God? The first guy brought it up. Okay, so now he's just recreating a narrative. Certainly that could be one. My experience is that's not been normally how things play out. Normally, there has been an idea that when there is an introduction, either literally of the transcendent God putting a hand into science, it's been, well, show me God. And you can go simply to YouTube. That's the best way to validate what's being said. Go to YouTube, look at any number of debates, look at any number of presentations about the subject matter of God and science, and listen if that person is a member of the just science establishment, right, or the void of God science establishment, right? Void of God here meaning that they don't take consideration of God in the science. Listen to their ideas about God in that way. Even if they're not atheists, even if they're not, even if they belong rather to a particular religious tradition, but they're acting with the hat of science on, right? Very clearly, they will say, well, you have to prove, show me there's God. My point, let me get to my point. My point was the burden of proof is not on the theist. Because if a person comes who's atheist, and I made the statement, mostly everybody, or really in reality, people are agnostic. They don't know whether there's God or not. Atheists, I did directly say in my video, are agnostics with an attitude. They can't confirm or deny whether there's God or not, but they speak out, no, there's no God. Like you can look at Richard Dawkins, right? And I'm using him only because it's a prominent model, but there's several clones and copies, etc. But he's directly saying there is no God. In fact, he's written a book, The God Delusion. So by that, there's an indication that here someone is who's very prominent in science. And again, I don't want to be called out on a fault of taking a rotten apple and spoiling the entire orchard. I don't want to do that. But there is a huge section of the apple orchard that is like this, right? He says that basically there's the God delusion, which would indicate if we're living on a planet with, I can't remember how many billions of people, let's take 7 or 8, 9 billion people, more than half, according to any research that you do, have a conception of God or supreme being, something beyond the physical, etc. So you're basically saying half the world's population is in delusion, right? And the minority is in the same position. And you can find that in various formats spoken by people who assert the whole atheistic worldview, right? But when it comes down to it, they don't factually know whether there is God or not. So the onus of proving God is not on the theist. What can happen is that the atheist can approach a theist, I am in ignorance on this subject matter. I don't know whether there's God or not. So I'm asking you, can you explain how there is God? But if you come and you declare that there is no God, prove it to me. Well, first of all, we're not having a discussion. You've essentially made a declaration that you need to prove. You need to prove that there is no God. because you're making that declaration. If I say, well, God did such and such, you can question, well, how would you say God did this? How do you account for a God? I am in ignorance. I do not know. But as soon as you open your mouth and say, there is no God, you've just put the onus of proof on you. So that was my point about burden of proof. Because you'll look at many interviews where, I don't know, unwitting theists put themselves in a position where they're being interrogated, in some cases, by atheists, and there's a constant barrage of, like, you got the onus to prove it on, you have the onus, or the burden of proof is on you. You have to prove to me there is a God. You understand? And of course, once you start to challenge their real desire to take up the scientific method, observation, experimentation, etc., which means come and take up a particular process of revelation to find God, you're not willing to get that. So they not only want you to prove God, but they want you to prove it under their terms. You understand? So, anyway, that was my position on burden of proof. So if it was not clear in the video, which it was, because exactly what he quoted is what I said. And the alternative narrative that he gives very well could be. I don't see that as being the majority of how this plays out. I see it mostly as people coming with a preconceived idea that there is no God. And therefore, debates normally don't take place on the basis of a conversation that evolves to a question about God, but usually it's already presupposed by a person that there is no God, and then they come and they want to lay the burden of proof on the theist to prove that there is. All right, so let me just read a couple of things so we don't, again, elongate. So you are saying someone can walk into a room of people and give his or her own spiel on how they already know God and then demand that those in the room prove him wrong. So, of course, this is a red herring right here. So it's like you're taking a scenario and that you don't really see so much, right? And putting it out as, well, this is something that always happens, and therefore you're somehow or another miscuing the innocent position of atheists, right? If you think about it, the very nature of the two postures, a theist says they accept that there is a God. In almost every case, depending on levels of maturity, that has come from a revelation and experience they're having. So they are in the know about that experience. Now, it could be argued that the experience is subjective, but I've argued that the experience is both subjective and objective. How? Subjectively, I may be having a realization about God. The atheist is approaching me in ignorance of God. They don't know or not know, right? That's the real posture. They're saying there is none, but factually speaking, they're not having that experience, or they would obviously not be saying there's no God, yet they can't prove that there isn't one. So if I'm having the subjective experience that there is a God, I'm in that position of knowing. So you can only inquire from me, how do I know there's God? That's what you can ask, how do I know there's God? Right? But you don't often see people walk into a room, though it could be, and demand, listen, there's a God, and everybody in here who doesn't believe me has to prove there isn't. You don't see that scenario many times, and again, I would appeal go on any kind of media of any sort and see how many of those scenarios you can pull up. People walked into a room and said, yeah, there's a God. Anybody doesn't believe it, you have to prove there's no God. But conversely, look at how many times there are debates or other things where an atheist will come in, or an atheist will appear simply on the street in a conversation and say, prove that there's God. So we have to be a little bit realistic when we want to have a discussion like that. Right? All right, what else? Let me see. Okay, but again, if a person walks through a door and therein someone is giving his or her talk on how they allegedly know God, it would only be decent of the person doing so when asked to explain. You're absolutely right. That's exactly what I said in my video. I said that. I said, really, if an atheist comes and they're saying, I don't know, can you explain to me how there's God? That's the proper etiquette. I actually directly mentioned that the posture of humility should be taken. Because if I was approaching someone who knows auto mechanics and I did not know, I can't walk and say, prove to me how this works, prove to me how that works. I'm approaching from a position of ignorance. I don't know. Now, I can say, well, I doubt that this would do this, or I doubt that. Can you explain how? I directly said that, so there's no contention there. But that's not normally what happens with atheists, right? And certainly, the person has to be aware of how many times, and again, the proof would be to pull it up in any kind of media, the amount of situations where there's debates, and you don't see atheists humbly approaching and asking, well, listen, I really don't know if there's God or not. I don't believe it right now. I don't have enough evidence for it right now. Can you please explain to me how there's God? More than not, it's like, there is no God, you prove that there is. And my point was, the onus of that proof is not on the theists. They're in the know. They're having the experience. You understand? Now, I will grant that if you have a neutral setting, just like in the video, I was giving proof from Vedic Sastra of the manifest form of God in the creation to prove that the idea of God is not something that simply has to depend on the transcendent experience of God. But I was proving that from Vedic Sastra it is mentioning that God is actually everywhere in the creation. Directly in one Sastra it's mentioned, Andantra Paramanu Chayantra Staham. So two amazing factors are brought out here. So it's saying, God is actually saying that I am present in every atom. So first of all, atoms are being talked about, thousands and thousands of years ago. So they weren't discovered in 1857 or 27, I can't remember, right? But they're talking about atoms, and God is saying, I'm within every atom. So everything we see in the material world is nothing but a composition of atoms. You understand? Similarly, God has said, Bhumi apo nalo vayu, kamanam bhuriyevacha, ahankarityame, bina prakriyastana, that I'm present in all of the transmutations of the material energy. You understand? Because there's atoms in all of these things. You understand? So I was saying, really, in this debate, it's not a matter of asking someone to see an invisible, transcendent, beyond material existence form of God. We can start with baby steps. Look at the creation itself. The whole posture of intelligent design, and I'm not fully in agreement with every single thing about intelligent design. I just think it's a good step that they're realizing that in approaching the limits of empiric experience related to the creation of cosmos and human existence, that you can begin to see, there's definitely got to be some kind of intelligent handed work here. Because I've also brought up the point in the video that science certainly is based on empirical observation. So I brought up the point, where in the day-to-day empirical observation of things do you see anything of order and intelligence and function that was done by no intelligence? Where do we see that? In fact, it would be delusional if I went to someone and suggested, I really wanted to have a house built. I put brick, stone, mortar, water, all the necessary ingredients there, and I waited a few days, and over the course of time, I came back and it had naturally evolved into my house. So I gave the example that the entire universal structure, gravity, everything else, works on really tight tolerances. A little shift one way or another, not trying to espouse whatever the mathematical metrics are for that, but the tolerances are very small. In our body, the way our body works, right? The tolerances of how everything needs to work like this, and this needs to digest this, it's not a lot of room for error. To suggest there's no intelligent hand in those factors, the cosmos and our own existence, I don't think is very logical, for one. But we don't have even any empirical experience of that. But we're being asked to accept a hypothesis, a theory, a possibility that this all happened over a period of time which no one experienced, right? There was no actual observer at the beginning of the creation, right? Right? So this is all like a retrospective hypothesis built on one theory after another with a retrospective look that's advanced with certain technology, so forth, so on, but it can never be conclusive. It can never be conclusive. But it's being presented that way. Another point that was brought out just a little while ago, it's not really in his letter, so I don't want to say something. I don't know, he'll see the video obviously at some point, but I don't want to say because he didn't say that in his questions here. But just a while ago, we were having a discussion back and forth, and he suggested that science is not trying to present something absolute. But the way it's taught in school is, this is what happened. So you'd have to go back and correct that, and I think that was the impetus for people going to the school board and saying, well, give kids the opportunity for the critical thinking. Well, this is the theory, but there may be many things here that we can't account for. There may be some things that are wrong here. So we would advise that you can do research. This is science. Do more research. Try to understand it better. And there should be no harm in taking a look at it from a theological, philosophical perspective. That shouldn't be ruled out. Understand? All right, I am really late for class. Fortunately, other people are facilitating it. All right. The thing is when one takes the role of the evangelical preacher or prophet or messenger of God, that person is approaching people and taking the offense. I think that's kind of conjecture, because now it's the same thing like I told about Dawkins. I'm not saying he is every single scientist. So you cannot say that any person who presents to represent any religious tradition is axiomatically taking a certain kind of posture. So that's conjecture. You can't prove that. In the same way, I would never say every scientist is Richard Dawkins, right? I've said in my experience, in my empirical experience, right? And, first of all, I've been in the Christian Consciousness movement in association from 1972, right? 1979, I went to Africa to open temples, and I lectured at universities in Africa in many places, and I actually had those experiences, not to mention in other places, right? I've had those experiences of confrontation by people in the atheistic community. Now, whether that arose in a lecture setting or whatever the case is, which I never mind if it arises, well, I'm challenging you based on what you said, that's fine. But I've not experienced, person comes as a messenger prophet and they approach people taking the offense. I've not seen that. So, on the other hand, like, for instance, our Srila Prabhupada, he may come and he may, speaking from Vedic cosmology, say, well, we don't accept this theory, or we don't accept that theory in science, or we don't accept this fact of science. And then he gives his explanations why, etc., etc. That's not offensive. That's simply him speaking to those who are following the theology that he's preaching. He's making clarification. And if somebody who's not in the theological association or institution or model, whatever you want to say, they may be coming simply like many reporters, scientists, professors used to come and speak to our Srila Prabhupada, right? So he may be answering their questions from the point of view of Vedic cosmology. That's not offensive, or that's not being on the offense. That's just simply stating his realizations and his perspective. He's not closed the door to people stating theirs, right? All right. These things are always hard to do. Imagine how hard this would be to start trying to look at a screen and type all this stuff down. All right. I think there's maybe two more, and then I'm going to have to go. I'll maybe finish it another time. Debate the term burden of proof. Well, we kind of covered that. So let's bypass it, because we've kind of covered it, and we're kind of starting to rehash certain things. Same thing. So yes, in a friendly discussion, there is not some mandate, some imposition on one or the other to provide. So we've covered burden of proof. I'm not going to, and I think that's the bottom of the line of his questioning. All right, let me just take a look at it as far as where the discussion began, which gives insight into who made a claim first and who is therefore being asked to explain. All right, so now he's asking that since I'm making a statement, the burden of, I guess he's saying the burden of proof is on me. Let me see, as far as I can see, it began when Mukunda made a statement in which he called everyday scientific method based on science is godless. I'm not saying it as a personal opinion. Science does not, in the modern context, accommodate the variable of God. right? That's a specific thing. And if you go back and looking at the history, which I started off the entire video with, there was the scientific revolution. There was a separation of science from the patronage of the Catholic Church, etc., etc. Now, remember, I also mentioned this is something that primarily happened in Europe, because in many other places in the world, the synthesis of science, philosophy, religion stayed as a synthesis, right? But in Europe at that time, late 1800s, early 1900s, that separation took place, and under the secular model of science, there was the absence of an idea of God as being part of that. That's undeniable. So you can do research on it. I invite everybody to pull up the research on it, right? Now, does anything say that that's in every nook and corner of every single situation? Nobody's saying like that. We're saying that's the predominance of how science was modeled. And today it's modeled like that. Today it's modeled like that. That science essentially does not accommodate God as a variable in their system. Even in the scientific method, you can't introduce that variable. And we just had a discussion about that, so I won't carry on any further with that. And from that point, I tried to give the idea that science takes an approach where it never makes a positive or negative statement as to whether there is or not a God. I'm inviting you to go and pull up any number of media on science and God. Go pull up any number of media on science and God. And especially if you look at it in a debate format and see the position of those who espouse science in the modern context, whether or not they accept God as a working principle in science. You understand? So see if you find that. I'm inviting you to go pull up everything you can. See if you find in the modern context of science that the scientists accept God as part of the working model of doing their science. Now, I'm not talking about here that the conclusion of their scientific method has to say, and then God did it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, including the idea, intelligent design is the best example. Because right now, intelligent design is working in the scientific model, including the scientific methodology, right? Hypothesis, experiments, observations, replications, predictions. It's working in that model. There's actually experiments and everything else going on in the community of intelligent design. So I think that may be the best model to look at in terms of what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about Muslims, Christians, or Hindus walking in and saying, well, we want that you should pray before you start calculating, or that we insist that you have to put the name of God. We're saying accounting for factors about a supreme being, right? Let's take baby steps. Acknowledge consciousness. That's not even really acknowledged yet. And my sense here is, how can you have a science that deals with the human experience in any capacity that doesn't really accommodate what's human? So right now, which is another, point we just went through previously when we were discussing elsewhere, is that without the acknowledgement of consciousness, which then leads to what is the seat of consciousness, how can you have an adequate discussion about the human condition? So I brought up the fact that there is an idea, and you'll hear some scientists say it, we're simply a chemical, biological phenomenon. And there are many scientists who actually believe that. And that's the extent of our existence. It doesn't leap back into a consciousness, therefore soul, and therefore relationship of the soul with a God. You understand? But here my thing is the baby step, consciousness, the hard problem. Let's solve it. Is there consciousness or not? Those are things that are, they're obviously on the periphery again, they're being experimented on. But in mainstream, modern, empirical, natural science, which is looking at the world, right, we need to account for that as a variable. Right? We even need to know who's looking at the world. Is it just my eyes and brain that's looking at the world? So there's just so many things. If you don't accommodate consciousness, what to speak of God, right? With baby steps, consciousness, how can it truly be science? This was one of my propositions. And at best, it cannot be the full definition of science. You understand? So I'm extremely late for class, but there are other devotees on, and I think they're facilitating it. Today is Advaita Saptami, so all glories to Sri Advaita Acharya, and may he bestow his causeless mercy on us. Certainly it's a wonderful thing that it was Advaita Acharya who called for the appearance of Sriman Mahaprabhu. And it's very important to understand in our theology now, I've left the realm of my objective discussion with science and all that, and I'm speaking theologically here. Panchatatvakam Krishnam Bhakta Rupa Swarupakam Bhakta Avataram Bhaktakyam Namama Bhakti Shaktikam. To understand this verse, if you're following the line of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, is very, very important. Because here it's mentioning that the ultimate root, the very form of bhakti, has descended into this world. What is that bhakti root? It's a combined form of Radha and Krishna. Radha and Krishna represent the pinnacle of love. I'm not going into the deeper sections about theology, Ujjali money, all these things here, because not appropriate form. But Radha and Krishna are the pinnacle of what is prema, or love of God. The revelatory power that reveals what that is called Guru Tattva. That Akhanda Guru Tattva is called Nityananda. So in this verse, Panchatatvakam Krishnam Bhakta Rupa Swarupakam. The Bhakta Rupa I've just described, Bhakta Swarup, or the revelatory power to reveal what is the root of Radha and Krishna in the form of Mahaprabhu is called Nityananda Prabhu. But unless that reality descends to our plane to perform Leela, we will never understand it. Therefore, Sri Advaita Acharya is called the Bhakta Avatar. Bhakta Avatar means, by his arrangement, the descent of the Bhakta Roop, along with the principle of Guru Tattva, descends into our plane. Then the power to understand the Bhakta Roop manifested Sri Gadadhar, who's directly Srimati Radharani herself, or the Ashraya Jatiya, means the repository of love of God and the power to understand and love God. That power enters the heart of a pure devotee. Chaitanya Charitamrita Murari Gupta says, Sri Bhakti Ras Hridayatam Ataha Srivas Uchyate. Srivas is called Srivas because Sri Bhakti Rasa has entered his heart. The extension of the heart of Srivas is his courtyard in his house, called the Srivas Angan. There, Sriman Mahaprabhu demonstrated the beauty of love of God in its highest form in that courtyard of Srivas. So we are completely indebted to the mercy of Sri Advaita Acharya, who's also Mahavishnu Sadashiv, for making the descent of Sriman Mahaprabhu and the Ordoja Lila, means most magnificent, merciful Lila of Mahaprabhu appear in this world. I might dandavat pranam vancha kalpa taruvyacha kripa sindhuvevacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. I might not keep this video up because this video was just meant to answer that devotee's questions. So I'm really going to package it just to send to him, again, because I could not do all kinds of typing and all these kind of things. You know, even doing it verbally is tough, staring at a screen all the time. So certainly, you know, putting it all and then going back making corrections, it's just too much for me. I'm 70 years old at this point, so yeah, not going to happen. Short answer is one thing, but long, you know, drawn out things, I'm not doing that. All right, so I may not keep this up permanently. I may just send it to him, and once it's been satisfied, my responses, he can respond to whatever, and then, you know, I may do another one, or I actually maybe move on to part 2, which is proof of the history of creation in Srimad Bhagavatam. Very interesting. And really, when you start to look at it, you'll see its actual correlation with many of the things that science is leaning towards. This is why it's so ridiculous not to include the variables. Because if you really go back and look in many sastras, you'll begin to see how a lot of what is being discovered, right, has some correlation. But the problem was that at the time of the scientific revolution and the breaking away from the church, there was really an inability of the clergy at that time to really take the book of Genesis, which is an ontological narrative, and really give credence to that narrative to match what was being discovered scientifically. But Srimad Bhagavatam, Vedic Sastra, is not like that. Srimad Bhagavatam, Vedic Sastra, has a complete definition of what is creation, everything. Just to give you a hint, it's been described, I think the most recent scientific ideas of how many species there are somewhere around 8,700,000. Surprisingly, Vedic calculation is 8,400,000, something like that. But I will look it up directly and speak on it when we speak on the proof of creation in the context of Srimad Bhagavatam. Alright, धन्यवाद. Jai Radhe Radhe.